Is it fair to compare the Diaz brothers to one another? These two Stockton legends have put together a pair of truly remarkable and highly unique careers, achieving runs that, while not always counted among the best of the best, have certainly contained era-defining moments. Each man has an almost stubborn commitment to fighting exactly how they want to fight, and though this singularly minded approach sometimes got them in trouble against elite fighters who could stick to a game plan, their careers, when viewed as a whole, have been truly exceptional to behold. And this is in terms of both their competitive records and their growth as stars. These two iconic siblings managed to both reach the top of the fight game, ensuring that their family name would have a legacy worth remembering by the time they both hung up their gloves. And for this video, I just wanted to stack their careers up against each other for fun, even though I understand that they themselves would probably hate this as a concept. Full disclosure, I've always been a big fan of the Diaz brothers, in particular Nick, and I do think their careers as a whole are on an almost even level in terms of the overall competitive and commercial mark they've left, with Nick probably outdoing Nate in terms of his work in the cage, and Nate probably outdoing Nick outside of the cage. But to really get into the details of where these guys stand, let's take a look at things under a few headings. On a surface level, skill for skill, how do these brothers differ? Well, I think Nick is the more powerful and aggressive puncher, and better with his combinations up close. But Nate has a stronger understanding of boxing fundamentals. He rolls with shots better, has greater ring generalship, all while using his range more efficiently. I can't really separate the two on their legendary endurance, although I might say that Nate's chin is a little stronger, and Nick's cardio is weaponized to a greater extent. But both guys are neck and neck in a lot of these departments. In terms of the grappling, again, it's pretty tough to call, but I do think Nate has the better submission ability for MMA, while you could argue that Nick's overall ground game is slightly better. Neither guy is the greatest defensive wrestler in the world, but over the years I would eventually give the advantage to Nate in terms of takedown defense. But Nick is better at defending leg kicks, or at least Nate has been caught out by them a lot more, given that he fights at distance. In terms of their resumes, I think it's pretty clear that Nick hit a higher level in MMA and maintained that form for a lot longer. I think sometimes that people tend to disregard the level of competition that Nick fought outside of the UFC, but that run between losing to Sean Sherk in 2006 and then narrowly losing to Carlos Condit in 2011 saw a pretty high level of activity from Nick. And the only fighter he lost to during that time, the underrated KJ Noons, he thoroughly beat in their rematch. But in terms of consistency, Nate was facing a higher level of competition, and his form definitely suffered because of it. However, you shouldn't look past just how good Nick looked on his way to that UFC interim welterweight title fight against Carlos Condit, and I would argue that he actually won that fight. Sure, Nick wasn't in the UFC, but there were some very solid wins in there. But Nate's best moment in the cage, submitting Conor McGregor, that was the finest moment either of them have achieved. And don't sleep on his wins over Donald Cerrone, Anthony Pettis and Michael Johnson either. There's some very good victories in there. Nate spent pretty much his entire career in the UFC, and in some ways he didn't actually hit his prime until that post-2015 period. Because the Nate that fought Johnson and then later Conor McGregor seemed to be tying it all together in a way that his younger self had totally failed to do so. Indeed, he was getting a lot more favourable matchups during this stretch, but it was still a very good Nate we were seeing. I don't think the resume question is as straightforward as it seems, but Nick losing narrowly to Carlos Condit, then getting dominated by GSP, and then losing up in weight against Anderson Silva reads a little nicer than Nate's prime losses to Benson Henderson, Rafael dos Anjos, Josh Thompson, Jorge Masvidal, Leon Edwards, Conor McGregor, and then some of his earlier, more undersized welterweight appearances against Rory McDonald and Don Hyung Kim. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to let us know in the comments section below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to hit the like button. Anyway, back to the video. There are some X factors in play for both men, things that put their greatness into a perspective that you can't really pick up on paper. Sure, Nick Diaz losing 3 times in a row during his final prime run in the UFC, it wasn't great, but he arguably beat the unusually hesitant Carlos Condit, and then dropped decisions against 2 top 5 GOAT candidates, Georges St-Pierre and then up in weight against the returning Anderson Silva. Sure, Silva wasn't exactly in his prime, but GSP definitely was. Nick, based on his Strikeforce run and his subsequent fights with BJ Penn and Condit, could have been argued as 3rd best welterweight in the UFC at that point in time, but he just came up quite short against the overbearing stylistic matchup that George presented. I think people tend to forget just how far up the mountain Nick actually got, despite getting edged out by Condit and then thoroughly controlled by St-Pierre. After getting made an example of and banned from the sport for 5 years then on a trumped up marijuana charge, although it was later overturned, I think Nick very clearly lost faith in the fight game, and even though he was eventually eventually cleared to return, the hunger to be a part of that machine was gone. And I do think this dripped over into Nate's career as well, because Nate Diaz was well and truly messed around by the UFC for the largest part of his run, and those recently released emails from the ongoing antitrust lawsuit that clearly showed Joe Silva conspiring to feed Nate to a tough matchup on the prelims if he didn't accept yet another underpaid contract. Yeah, it really adds some disturbing context. When Nate eventually did reach the peaks of his fame, is it fair to say that he fought with less and less hunger with each passing appearance after the pair of bouts he had with Conor McGregor? Because by getting that level of fame he had already won, and glory in mixed martial arts just didn't seem to matter as much. The Pettis win was quite nice, but in that Masvidal bout there was more play acting, and then we saw to an even greater extent against Leon Edwards, even in the early stages, how easygoing he was. And that fight is interesting because on one hand you could make the argument that Nate's lackadaisical nature in the cage hindered him from getting the finish in the final minute of that fight, after he caught the future world champ cleanly and then wasted time by pointing at him, taking his foot off the gas, safe in the knowledge that he had officially stolen the moral victory. But to be honest, I think if Nate hadn't been so laid back in that fight, Leon probably would have had more openings to do even more damage, and that likely would have resulted in a far more one-sided contest than the one we got. In other words, I think Nate, if he'd fought harder in that fight, wouldn't have tagged Leon in the 25th minute. In fact, he might have even got finished the amount of shots he was taking. That was an undeniably great moment, a shocking moment for Nate Diaz, and I can't help but wonder how things might have played out if Nate, right there, decided to show hunger and try to rush in and finish Leon. Because if he had beaten Leon Edwards there, could it be said that it would be a win greater than anything Nick has ever had? Add in the McGregor submission and you'd have an argument for Nate reaching higher peaks. And in some ways you already do. In my eyes, Nate's win over Conor was the best moment in the cage that either Diaz brother achieved. It was also a moment that had a knock-on effect of turning Nate into a star, eclipsing his initial role as Nick's little brother, and causing those infamous words from Dana White that he was not a needle mover to age like milk. Nate managed to somehow pull off an all-time great late career U-turn, outdoing all expectations to become one of the 3 or 4 biggest crossover stars the UFC has ever produced. But I think Nick was the better fighter, relative to his time, and though Nate had the bigger win, I believe that Nick Diaz had the superior overall career. That run of 16 wins and 1 loss, and yes, I'm counting the Takanori Gomi win, it was a marijuana charge, who cares, but that run brought Nick right to the forefront of the welterweight division, first in Strikeforce and then later in the UFC, and he posed such a stylistic challenge to the action fighter Carlos Condit that Carlos fought to a strategy that was not indicative of his reputation as the natural born killer, and most fans still think that Condit lost that fight. Nick gets some stick for losing to Condit, GSP and Silva on his final run, and for the sake of this point I'm going to ignore the Robbie Lawler fight that came after 6.5 years out, but people do seem to act like this was proof that Nick Diaz couldn't hang with the top guys, thus making him a less than elite talent. But no, I firmly believe that Nick Diaz in that 2009 to 2013 window was one of the greatest welterweights on the planet, an elite guy who had a stylistic approach that made him a nightmare for most opponents. His stubborn nature, like Nate, would get him in trouble from time to time, but his wins over BJ Penn, Takanori Gomi, Robbie Lawler, Paul Daly and KJ Noons, these were awesome performances. And if you want to dig a little deeper, check out his exhilarating victories over Marius Zaromskis, the great but kinda past his prime Frank Shamrock, Jeremy Jackson, Evangelista Cyborg Santos. Basically just watch the dude's entire Strikeforce run, plus a scattering of any fights in that middle portion between his UFC stints. And watch all of these before you start putting too much focus on his loss to St. Pierre, because nobody beat GSP at this point. Well, except for Johnny Hendricks, although your mileage may vary on that one. So yeah, Nick Diaz in my opinion is an underrated fighter in the MMA history books, just as Nate was to some degree, although I think that has since shifted. I think Nick sustained a higher level of performance, showed higher technical abilities and attributes in more varied areas of the game, and overall had a more exciting career fight to fight. But look, that's just my opinion. I made this video simply for fun and to celebrate the careers of 2 MMA icons, and as always there's room for an interesting discussion in the comment section below. But what do you think of the Diaz brothers Nick and Nate, and where do you think they fall in relation to both each other and their contemporaries within their respective weight classes? Do let us know your opinions in the comment section below, and if you want to like the video and subscribe to the channel, that would be great. As always, thank you for watching.